all-out crypto war. What would that look like? Actually, we don't have to wonder because we've seen it. In the history of crypto, we've had many dramatic and traumatic events over the first decade of crypto, but this might have been the very most contentious. Most people don't understand how the early politics of crypto led to some insane decisions and even crazier price movements. So sit back and enjoy this look at some crazy crypto history, and at the very end of this video, I'm going to give you guys a coin you definitely must stay away from. Let's get it. I'm not a financial advisor! Welcome to Ben Armstrong Crypto X. Don't just trade crypto, experience it. All you have to do is hit that subscribe button to join Ben Nation. Be sure to hit that like button for us too. Back in the early days of Bitcoin, it was all fun and games, but when people started making serious money, the knives came out. Of course, I was around for all this stuff as I'm now in my 12th year in crypto. Good reason to subscribe to this channel. I've been here longer than probably the other top 3 crypto YouTubers you watch combined. And if you appreciate these more in-depth educational videos looking back in the history of crypto, make sure to hit the like button so I know to keep making them. In this video, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into one of the most important moments in Bitcoin history, the block size war that led to the infamous Bitcoin hard fork. This was a conflict over how Bitcoin would scale and how the network would be governed. Problems started when Bitcoin first started to get some mainstream attention. All the new users caused a spike in fees and transaction times, similar to the challenges that we see today with Ethereum and congestion. The original pitch that early adopters gave for Bitcoin was that it was a cheap, fast, and easy way to send money. It was supposed to be digital cash, but as more people began using the network, the fees increased and it was taking a long time to send a transaction. This was a disaster for Bitcoin businesses who were trying to onboard merchants and Bitcoin users trying to spread the gospel about crypto. Many of the retail traders in Bitcoin's Reddit discussions believed that the scaling dilemma should be the community's #1 priority, but not everyone in the industry was even concerned. Most of the Bitcoin developers at the time were not in a rush to reach mainstream adoption and felt the technology was still in an early experimental phase. But there were a few key developers like Mike Hearn and Gavin Andreessen who were heavily focused on the scaling issue. Hearn was a Google engineer before leaving the corporate world behind to work on Bitcoin. Andreessen was one of the most prolific Bitcoin developers when it was first getting off the ground. It was famously in close contact with Satoshi. Andreessen worked directly with Satoshi in the beginning when very few people were interested, so he became one of Satoshi's most trusted peers. Andreessen was so important to Satoshi that he was the recipient of Satoshi's final email. This was Satoshi's message to Andreessen. "I wish you wouldn't keep talking about me as a mysterious, shadowy figure. The press just turns that into a pirate currency angle. Maybe instead make it about the open source project and give more credit to your dev contributors. It helps motivate them." Days before that, Satoshi had also written to Mike Hearn saying, "I've moved on to other things. It's in good hands with Gavin and everyone." Before leaving, Satoshi also handed over control of the Bitcoin website and repository to Andreessen. Because of his close ties to Satoshi, Andreessen's opinions carried a lot of weight in the community. Bitcoin was still an open source project though, and the network was intentionally designed to prevent one person from gaining too much power. So Andreessen couldn't just make decisions about scaling on his own. He had to debate with the other developers to get them to agree to any change that he wanted to implement. Throughout 2014, debate had begun to heat up about a solution that was being proposed to Bitcoin's scaling issue, increasing Bitcoin's maximum block size, which was 1 megabyte. Lowering the fees and transaction times was a top priority for Andreessen and Hearn, so they wanted to increase the block size as soon as possible. But a lot of the other developers had concerns. Most of them felt that it needed to be done very slowly and carefully. For Andreessen, Hearn, and the other advocates of bigger blocks, it started to seem like the other developers were stalling. By the way, if you haven't checked out our channel's sponsor, Stake, then you need to stop stalling. Stake is the world's largest social casino where you can win gold coins and chat while you play. Visit the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen to get started with your account today at Stake. Fun, games, social chat, and more. Armstrong Crypto X is powered by Stake. Big block supporters, or big blockers as they came to be called, felt that time was running out. Bitcoin had captured the world's attention, but that attention span is only so long, and many Bitcoiners were worried that this small window of time would be their only opportunity to reach mainstream adoption. Now it seems funny to look back almost 10 years later and think that was our only chance for mainstream adoption, but this was a legitimate concern at the time. Many of the merchants that signed on to accept Bitcoin were canceling the feature as fast as they rolled it out, and it was becoming a lot harder to promote Bitcoin to new users. In early 2015, Andreessen and Hearn started a campaign for bigger blocks and asked for support from the rest of the Bitcoin developers and community. Mike Hearn made a Bitcoin Improvement Proposal, or BIP, which called for a hard fork that would introduce the new software called Bitcoin XT. The new client would increase the block size to 8 megabytes, along with some other upgrades. A fork is basically a split in the chain, and this can happen one of two ways, in the form of a soft fork or a hard fork. Hard forks are much more serious and dangerous than soft forks. Hard forks are updates to the protocol that are not compatible with previous versions, which either nullifies the old chain or creates a situation where there are two different networks and assets that grew from the same root. Soft forks, on the other hand, are backwards compatible with previous versions, so they allow for upgrades to take place more seamlessly and with less risk. At first, Hearn's idea for a hard fork didn't get much attention, but it started to pick up traction after it was publicly supported by Andreessen. This is when things really got heated and when factions began to form. It was becoming obvious that there were many different people who had different visions for Bitcoin, and it was becoming impossible for them to work together. On one side, there was the vision of the big blockers, private digital cash that can be sent instantly for just a few cents. And on the other side, there were the small blockers, who thought the Bitcoin's high fees were actually a good thing because it showed that the network was a success and because it would be able to pay for future development. They wanted to ensure that Bitcoin's blocks were always filled and the prices were always relatively high, because there were concerns that a surplus in block space could cause something called a fee death spiral. In the case of this catastrophic event, the supply of block space would be too large for the demand, causing a collapse in fees, possibly to zero, which would leave the miners with no payment and the network with no security. This is a legitimate concern, but celebrating high fees is not the solution. It wasn't just about the block size. Each side had its own different way of looking at Bitcoin too. The big blockers were most interested in the economics of the system, and many of them actually had a background in economics. Small blockers were usually more technically minded and better with coding. There were certainly some great programmers on the big block side, but they were outmatched by their small block opponents, who seemed to have a deeper knowledge of cryptography. The big blockers often recognized this fact, but they still believed that economic considerations were just as important as technical ones when it came to Bitcoin's design. Many of the big blockers also believed public opinion among the community should have some role shaping the governance. This idea benefited their side because the big block position was very popular among retail investors who wanted mainstream adoption to happen right away. Small blockers saw things differently. They saw Bitcoin as an extremely complex system that most people were unable to understand, so they didn't really value the opinions of people who they felt were less educated on the subject than they were. When it came to the debate over block size, small blockers had some very good arguments. They pointed out that if big blocks were rushed before other key upgrades were completed, it would become more difficult for smaller miners to earn Bitcoin rewards, making Bitcoin more centralized and giving too much power in the hands of industrial scale miners. Most agreed that a moderate block size limit would be needed at some point, but the size of the increases that were being proposed and the speed at which they would be rolled out was way too aggressive for many Bitcoin developers. The idea of forcing rule changes through a hard fork was another thing that made the move extremely unpopular among the developers. As far as the big blockers were concerned, desperate times, well, they called for desperate measures. From their perspective, Bitcoin was in danger of failure due to its scaling problems. In the summer of 2016, the rivalry became so intense that big blockers were banned from posting on the most popular Bitcoin forum on Reddit, r/Bitcoin. Think about that. The forum was filled with posts from retail investors and traders in the community that wanted lower fees and better user experience. These demands annoyed the small block developers, who felt that the big blockers were ignorant and reckless. So they turned to our old pal Censorship. The moderators of the Bitcoin subreddit forum blocked all conversations about block size. They said this was to avoid confusion about Bitcoin's roadmap and to allow the developers to have their technical discussions in peace. The big blockers responded by hacking the mods of the forum. You can't make this stuff up. Anytime I bring up hacks or safety, I always want to mention Afani, my cell phone service provider of choice. It works on either the AT&T or Verizon networks and keeps you safe from SIM card swapping. We got a link on the screen and one in the description if you want to check it out. I love it. Gregory Maxwell, a prominent Bitcoin developer who co-founded Blockstream with Adam back in 2014, poured gasoline on the fire by basically saying that the big blockers were a bunch of low IQ idiots. Sounds like something I would say. In a Reddit post, Maxwell suggested that the big blockers were just armchair quarterbacks, because most of them, well, they weren't actually developers. He compared big blockers to NASCAR fans and beer cup hats who shout out bad advice to the pit crew mechanics. Maxwell compared himself and the other developers to the mechanics in the pit crew, saying, while they're busily debating compression ratios and high-octane fuel and the seeming impossibility of getting the car to safely go much faster with the current state of technology you have, the guy staying on the sidelines with a beer cup hat saying, no problem, guys. let's remove the brakes. And the crowd goes wild. Finally, someone who cares about speed. This elitist attitude made Maxwell extremely unpopular among the average Bitcoin user. His company Blockstream, one of Bitcoin's top development groups, started taking heat on social media. Big bloggers pointed out that most of the Bitcoin developers worked for Blockstream at the time, giving them somewhat of a monopoly over the development. These are a lot of the conflicts of interest in Bitcoin and the politics I talk about with you guys all the time. The community was upset that developers seemed to be excluding them from a decision-making process that they thought was democratic. It's something I brought up many times. After weeks of total censorship, a moderator named Thamos told the community that their opinions didn't matter. He said, just because many people want something doesn't make it right. And that if 90% of r/Bitcoin users find these policies to be intolerable, then I want these 90% of r/Bitcoin users to leave. Both r/Bitcoin and these people will be happier for it. He goes with, the purpose of moderation is to make the community a good one, which sometimes includes causing people to leave. I don't disagree with that, to be honest with you. They most recommended that anyone who disagreed with the developers could move to a different subreddit so that r/Bitcoin can get back to the business of discussing Bitcoin news in peace. They should have thought of just stealing it, taking it over. This is a massive turning point. Many retail investors felt that they were no longer welcome to be a part of the Bitcoin community unless they went along with what the Blockstream developers wanted. The censorship was condemned by many industry leaders, including by Tyler Buterin.
I definitely think the censorship on the Bitcoin subreddit is very unfortunate, and I do think that it's very contrary to the kind of values that we want to have and support in the cryptocurrency and blockchain ecosystem.
And Brian Armstrong. The censorship issue also forced many of the libertarians in the industry to join the war and pick sides. Bitcoin Jesus, Roger Ver, was the most famous recruit to the big blockers. Many point to him as the founder because he did become the face of the movement, but he was just recruited. Ver was already siding with the big blockers because he was involved in a bunch of different Bitcoin businesses that were being held back by the scaling issue. Ver became even more vocal after the censorship started, and he was quickly recognized as a leader in the big block camp. This also made him public enemy number one for the small blockers, and they did everything they could to discredit him. After the split of the Reddit forum, an official division between the developers took form. Small blockers who continued working on Bitcoin's original client began referring to themselves as Bitcoin Core and separated themselves from developers who began working on updates that they didn't approve. The Bitcoin Core team maintained control of r/Bitcoin, the most popular Reddit forum, and had most of Bitcoin's main developers. Other devs who publicly argued for bigger blocks had their admin privileges revoked on the forum and were considered to no longer be Bitcoin developers. According to Bitcoin Core, the developers building towards bigger blocks were now working on altcoins. Whether you like to trade Bitcoin or altcoins, Phemex is the place to go. Make sure to click the Phemex link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen. Then don't forget to grab your Palau e-residency program card so you can KYC when your card comes in the mail. It's how all the cool kids are trading these days. You can tell because I'm doing it. Now, during the BlockSides war, the Bitcoin Core developers also banned any Bitcoin businesses associated with big blockers. This included exchanges like Coinbase and miners like Bitmain, the #1 miner at the time. Both of them were removed from the official Bitcoin.org website for their association with the big block case. After that, the big blockers moved over to Bitcoin.com, which was owned and controlled by Roger Ver. Another distinction the small blockers were making at this time was what actually constitutes a Bitcoin user. According to them, only Bitcoiners who ran a full node can technically be considered to be users. But this framing of the Bitcoin community entirely left out the average traders and retail Bitcoin holders. These labels are important because if the network is governed by its users, the definition of the word user will impact who's allowed to participate in governance and who is not. This became relevant when the small blockers proposed a user-activated software that would implement the changes that they wanted over those preferred by the miners and Bitcoin businesses. There were three major factions fighting for influence over the governance of Bitcoin at this time. It was made up of the developers, the businesses, which were led by the miners, and the community. Each of these factions preferred the solutions that would benefit them the most and give them the most control. The miners wanted hash rate to determine the governance because they were in charge of the hash rate. They also wanted bigger blocks because that would give the miners that were already established a huge advantage over hobbyists and newer miners. The developers believed that users who are running full nodes, well, they should be responsible for governance, and of course, the vast majority of them were running full nodes. Meanwhile, the Bitcoin community of traders, hodlers, and libertarians were hoping that there would be a public discussion on important decisions. This was just as much a battle over Bitcoin's governance as it was a battle over its block size. During the conflict, there were a few conferences hosted around the world where both factions gathered to discuss the future of Bitcoin scaling and make their case. First conference was hosted by Blockstream in Montreal, Canada, September of 2015, and it was called Scaling Bitcoin, but no progress was made. The big blockers were disappointed that the conference was more of a one-sided presentation than a negotiation, so they considered the event a failure. Many of them called the conference Stalling Bitcoin. These guys are so funny. Meanwhile, the big blockers were having trouble finding support for Mike Hearn's Bitcoin XT upgrade. It was eventually abandoned within a few months. January 2016, Mike Hearn gave up and declared Bitcoin a failed experiment in a controversial blog post where he announced that he was leaving the industry and selling all of his coins. This wasn't really true, though. He did go on to take a CEO role at a blockchain company called R3, and then continued in the industry after leaving that role too, but nobody really knows if he actually invested again. Things got even worse for the big bloggers after Gavin Andresen put his support behind Craig Wright, the man who still to this day provably falsely claims that he is Satoshi. In a 2016 blog post, Andresen claimed that Satoshi had returned and claimed that he saw cryptographic proof that Craig Wright was actually Satoshi. This proof was later published on Wright's blog, but the post didn't actually offer any evidence that Wright was Satoshi. Check out this video here.
I do think Craig is Satoshi. I met with him in London. He fits the kind of person that I was interacting with way back in 2010, and he provided some cryptographic proof using the private key from the very first Bitcoin block to show that he possessed that key. So although it's impossible to prove something like that 100%, I think for me, he's proved it beyond a reasonable doubt.
The Bitcoin community was unconvinced, but Wright supported big blocks, so Andresen continued to see him as a key ally. Some critics have speculated that Andresen was desperate to get his way in the conflict, so he was resorting to extreme measures. But some think he actually bought into the lies. Either way, Wright was welcomed by the big blockers with open arms, which majorly hurt their credibility, probably the biggest mistake they made. After making his blog post declaring that Satoshi was back, Andresen had his access removed from the Bitcoin website and repository. He was the only big blocker that was allowed to remain because of his historical connection to the Bitcoin project. But teaming up with Craig Wright, well, that was a step too far. First, Bitcoin Core claimed that they suspected he was hacked because the blog was so ridiculous. But then after finding out that it was real, they decided it would be best to not add him back. Gavin Andresen's reputation would never recover from backing up Craig Wright's fake Satoshi story. In another battle, the small blockers came up with a technical solution that was somewhat of a compromise. It was an upgrade called Segregated Witness, also known as Segwit, which freed up block space without increasing the block size, and fixed some bugs and improved the security of the network. This upgrade would happen through a soft fork instead of a hard fork, which would not require a new client or risk a chain split. Unfortunately, Segwit didn't bring the factions together. It made things even worse. They'd become so distrustful of each other that it was too late for compromise. The conflict had become about a lot more than just block size. Big blockers saw this as another stall tactic, while small blockers said that the only reason to reject Segwit was to protect the big miners. On April 5th, 2017, Mr. Beer Cup Hat Gregory Maxwell sent a letter to the Bitcoin mailing list accusing one of the world's largest mining firms of opposing Segwit for financial reasons. According to Maxwell, many miners were opposed to Segwit because it prevented something called covert ASIC boost, a function that would give them massive power over the system. Maxwell didn't mention them by name, but his letter was taking shots at the Chinese mining firm Bitmain, one of the largest mining firms in the industry at the time, and many journalists were quick to pick up on this and publish the accusations. Bitmain responded with a press release where they denied running covert ASIC boost on the main Bitcoin blockchain, but they admitted to both running it on testnet and filing patents for it, which was a sketchy denial at best. To be fair, the big blockers leveled similar accusations against Bitcoin Core and Blockstream, saying that their business model was dependent upon small blocks and they held patents related to Segwit. In 2017, many miners, including Bitmain, were refusing to upgrade to Segwit, insisting that their hashing power should determine which upgrades go through. The developers and the miners were fighting over control of governance, and things were starting to get ugly. The entire Bitcoin network was at risk. At this point, an unlikely mediator stepped in, an entrepreneur by the name of Barry Silbert. Silbert began his career shortly after college with the 2004 launch of a company called Second Market, a website for trading alternative financial investments. While many across the country were losing their homes and savings during the 2008 financial crisis, Second Market made Silbert a fortune. Then as Bitcoin started catching media attention, Silbert shifted his focus. In 2015, he sold Second Market to NASDAQ and started the Digital Currency Group, one of the top mafias in crypto. Ever since, he's played a major role in the crypto industry, and Digital Currency Group now has its hands in almost everything. although their influence has been waning after suffering major losses and embarrassments during the crypto winter of 2022. And of course, silver did step down right before the BTC ETFs recently went live. At the height of the block size war drama, though, the digital currency group hosted a conference in New York called Censorship, where some of the most powerful people and companies in the space got together to finally come to some kind of agreement. However, blockchain representatives, well, they refused to show up. The businesses, miners, and handful of developers at the meeting came to an agreement that seemed to be a compromise. Segwit would be implemented for the small blockers, and the big blockers would get a small increase in the block size. The big blockers agreed to these terms, but the Bitcoin core team rejected the deal and said that they would support only Segwit, not the block increase, and they would not compromise. This is when it started to become obvious that Bitcoin could seriously split in two. Many of the miners who planned to support the block increase lost confidence and backed out because they were afraid about what a hard fork might do to Bitcoin. This was a major turning point for the small blockers. Now they were in control. The big blockers would not be getting their way, at least not on the official Bitcoin chain. They would need to work off on their own chain. And so that's what they did. In mid-2017, the big blockers decided that they would go ahead with a hard fork because the blockstream developers would not raise the block size. It was simple. The hard fork created its own crypto asset that would compete directly with Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash with the ticker BCH. When the fork took place on August 1st, 2017, Bitcoin holders were rewarded with an amount of Bitcoin Cash that was equal to the figure in their BTC wallet. Now the race was on to see which side can gain the most market share and the highest price, claiming the title of the real Bitcoin. The community again had a seat at the table and could place bets on which vision they believed in the most. Some users decided to sell their BCH to buy BTC or vice versa, depending on which side of the war they were on. Other investors hedged their bets and held on to both, wanting to have a piece of the winning pie regardless of which direction things went. There was total chaos when Bitcoin Cash finally launched on exchanges, with some of the most wild volatility the industry has ever seen. I saw it with my own eyes, and that's saying a lot. The price of BCH went crazy, especially on Coinbase, reaching almost as high as $4,000 or crashing down to under $1,000. The price swings were so intense on Coinbase that insider trading was suspected, and there was a massive investigation about whether or not employees traded on the inside info. It could have just been the hype too, or maybe certain exchanges didn't have enough liquidity to satisfy the initial rush of buyers. We see this type of volatility happen all the time these days after the launch of low liquidity projects, so that's a possibility too. Coinbase never announced the results of their investigation, but they promised to do better in the future. We all know what that means. The Bitcoin Cash community was extremely powerful at first, and the movement's leaders like Bitmain and Roger Ver only poured millions of dollars into marketing and building partnerships, especially in places like Africa and Latin America, where crypto is needed the most. Unfortunately for the big blockers, these campaigns, well, they never really gained steam because they were launching just as the bear market was setting in. And infighting was destroying the Bitcoin Cash community. Craig Wright decided to launch his own fork, which he called Bitcoin SV, or Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision, a coin you should always stay away from. A small cult following believed that Wright was Satoshi and went along with him into the project. But the asset hasn't really done anything in terms of price or development since its launch other than a few random pumps here and there. After this second fork, many of the big blockers became fed up with Bitcoin altogether and decided to get more into Ethereum instead. At first, the Bitcoiners were happy to get rid of the big blockers and other rebels in their community because they felt there were too many people trying to change Bitcoin and influence the work. But after a while, some members of the Bitcoin community, well, they started to get mad that the people they exiled moved on to other projects because they started to see those projects as a threat. And this is where toxic Bitcoin maximalism really started to take hold. Crypto culture, maximalism is the idea that you should only be investing in one asset. So Bitcoin maximalists invest only in Bitcoin. And there's really nothing wrong with that. It's okay. But there are some Bitcoin maximalists who are very toxic, calling everything else a scam and attacking other communities because they're working on or investing in something other than Bitcoin. This is especially weird considering that so many people who wanted to do things differently were kicked out of the Bitcoin community. So what became of Bitcoin Cash? These days, it's basically on life support still. Developers are still working on it, and it's still used as a currency sometimes, especially in the developing markets where it was heavily promoted. Roger Ver has stepped out of the spotlight, but he still works on Bitcoin Cash behind the scenes. He's taken heavy losses for his big bet on the hard fork. He has also been smeared by the Bitcoin community, who've painted him as an enemy and never looked back. A lot of Bitcoin maximalists like to say that he was greedy, just wanted to run his own chain. But many of the people who spend any time working with him say that his libertarian beliefs are what drove him. It wasn't about money. He truly believed that digital cash was a better way of subverting the government than digital gold. Roger Ver is one of the most important advocates for Bitcoin in history. It's pathetic that he's been vilified. Honestly, makes me sick. I like Roger, and I think a lot of him. BCH was never able to return to his all-time highs in the following cycle, and the future is certainly looking rough from an investment standpoint. The industry has grown to the point that there are now faster and more convenient forms of digital cash, with many options to choose from, and Bitcoin Cash has fallen into the background. Just like Litecoin and many other crypto assets for payments that were once at the top of the charts. Now their place has been taken by stablecoins, which are much more practical for payments. Throughout the block size war, the number of competing cryptocurrencies and crypto assets began to skyrocket, and a lot of Bitcoin users and developers were realizing that they had their own visions for the technology that would never be accepted by Blockstream and Bitcoin Core. So they decided it was best to go elsewhere. This was probably for the best though. Bitcoin is probably better off with a very slow, meticulous development process that prioritizes security over scalability. And it's also better that we now have over 10,000 crypto assets instead of just one. As much as the Bitcoin maximalists like to deny this fact, the thriving market of competing crypto assets that we have today actually makes the industry a more innovative space that can generate even more wealth than Bitcoin could on its own. At the end of the day, the block size war was a power struggle and conflict over the future of Bitcoin. Both sides had some very intelligent people with some great ideas, and both sides used dirty tricks to advance their causes. Small blockers were wrong to censor the Bitcoin community and talk down to them, but many of their technical concerns, like miner centralization, well, they were dead on. Their vision of Bitcoin as digital gold is also why many of us have been able to make a lot of money in these markets. The big blockers weren't innocent either. They were wrong to force rule changes and rush consensus, but their fight for private digital cash was an admirable one, and they had many valid criticisms about Bitcoin's development and the centralization around Blockstream. If all these players have been able to set aside their differences and their egos, come to a reasonable compromise, we might have been better off as an industry to this day. These incredibly talented and skilled people were fighting against each other instead of working together, which seems like a lot of wasted creativity. Sure, competition's great, and it's a good thing that protocols can fork when there's disagreement. It's also great that we have a wide variety of crypto assets outside of Bitcoin, but things could have been handled much differently. If you like learning about these interesting stories from crypto history, then you'll love my books, Catching Up to Crypto and Catching Up to FTX. Pick up your copies, the links and QR codes on the screen. Let me know what you think about this pivotal moment in crypto history down below in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button on your way out, and it helps us keep the lights on. Be blessed.